Yu-Gi-Oh! 5Ds is one of those shows that always has me scratching my head. Ever since I started my YouTube channel, I've been bombarded with comments about how 5Ds is the best of all Yu-Gi-Oh! Anime, and how there's not even a close second. I just couldn't get over the zany concept of Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards being played with while riding on motorcycles. Can you really blame me? I started with Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Monsters, which took us from a rich guy's island with a castle to ancient Egypt. Then Yu-Gi-Oh! GX came along and put all of our duelists in school, and now they're racing each other on motorcycles. Even as a kid, I thought this was the goofiest thing ever. It's a real shame too, because I've always believed that the cards to come from Yu-Gi-Oh! 5Ds were nothing short of amazing. To this day, the Signer Dragons are among my favorite to collect. And while Ghost Rare cards were technically introduced during the GX era, it wasn't until the introduction of Synchro Monsters with 5Ds that they truly hit their stride. And even though a large portion of these monsters were Dragon type, I never grew tired of them because the designs were incredibly creative. The character designs were also really cool, and I also liked the setting. I just couldn't wrap my head around those pesky motorcycles. Now here's the part where I tell you that I finally watched Yu-Gi-Oh! 5Ds, and I was pleasantly surprised. But is it the best of all Yu-Gi-Oh! Anime? We'll delve deeper into that later on. First, I need to set some ground rules. In this video, my focus will be on the Japanese version of the Yu-Gi-Oh! 5Ds anime. I never got around to watching the English version, so I can't comment on the extent of the differences. But considering it was 4Kids handling the English dub, I can only imagine that there are some variations. There's also the important fact that the last season of 5Ds never even received an English dub. And since we're discussing the Japanese version, you can expect to hear different names for some of the characters, cards, locations, and really anything else. And one last thing before we continue, do yourself a favor by subscribing to this YouTube channel. Trust me, you won't regret it. When I reflect on the golden days of Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Monsters, and even the less exciting times of Yu-Gi-Oh! GX, it's pretty obvious that friendship was the driving force behind many of the characters. The 5 pieces of Exodia symbolize the unity of Yugi's friend group. Yes, I'm counting Yami as the 5th person, and this unity is what led to victory over Kaiba, which not only gave Yugi his grandpa back, but also put an end to Kaiba's evil behavior. In Yu-Gi-Oh! GX, when Manjome loses to Judai, he stops looking down on people, eventually becomes friends with Judai, and then he almost beats Judai when they finally rematch. He loses on purpose for reasons I won't get into right now, so technically he was gonna win, but you get the point. Friendship is power in Yu-Gi-Oh! There are countless examples of this in every series, but 5Ds takes a slightly different approach. Friendship is certainly a major factor in the series, but it's almost like they flipped the script. Instead of using the protagonist to guide others through kindness and the joy of playing games, the story begins as a cautionary tale. In the opening scene of the first episode, we are introduced to Jack Atlas as he enters a packed stadium to defend his title, the King of D-Wheelers, which is essentially the king of games in this world. As Jack defeats his opponent, we cut to a scene of a cheering crowd. Fans watching on a big screen from outside the stadium, and a city collectively celebrating Jack's victory. Then we jump to Satellite District, a rundown wasteland where no cheers can be heard. This is where we meet our protagonist, Yusei Fudo, and we discover that Jack is from Satellite District and the two of them are very good friends. At least they were, until one day Jack stole Yusei's D-Wheel along with a certain card of his before fleeing the district. Then the next time Yusei saw Jack, he was being crowned the King of D-Wheels, and he did so using the stolen items. For a while, the first arc feels like a revenge story where the protagonist desperately tries to take back what was rightfully his. I can't stress enough how different this character dynamic is from the typical Yu-Gi-Oh! Rivalry. While people often draw parallels between Jack and Kaiba since they're both rival characters in their respective series, Jack's character bears a closer resemblance to Joey Wheeler, albeit with a dark twist. Imagine if the first episode of Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Monsters concluded with Joey becoming envious of Yugi. After witnessing the power of Exodia and his own helplessness in saving his sister's eyesight, he then pilfers the 5 pieces of Exodia along with Yugi's entry items for Duelist Kingdom. Then he makes his way to the island alone, and once there he is able to defeat Pegasus and become the king of games. Now Yugi must overcome Joey in order to rescue his grandpa and even the score. I know that sounds absurd considering their close friendship, but much like Joey and Yugi, Jack and Yusei were very close friends. Everything changed when Jack saw an opportunity to escape Satellite and realize his dream. And while it is hard to pin 5Ds as a revenge story, it certainly has one of the better depictions of it in the realm of anime. When Yusei gets his card back and finally defeats Jack, there's no celebration, no sense of joy, or even a sigh of relief. Instead, Yusei's victory only serves to divide them further. Before the climactic face-off in the city, we see Jack waiting with bated breath for their reunion, as if he knew that his past actions would catch up to him and couldn't wait to settle the score. But when Jack is defeated decisively, the rivalry is completely shattered. His competitive spirit crumbles, and since he was defeated on the world stage by a nobody from Satellite District, his title of king has been replaced with fraud. Even when Jack offers his reasons for betraying Yusei, it does him no favors. If anything, it makes Jack look even worse, because it confirms that he was only acting in self-interest. Consequently, Jack suffers from a crisis of identity, while Yusei's deep-seated trust issues continue to linger. It's not until much later, when the two are forced to team up, that they're finally able to begin the process of rebuilding their fractured bond. This level of nuance isn't limited to just Jack and Yusei. Yu-Gi-Oh! 5D's is full of complex characters with unique circumstances that ultimately draw them together. Let's revisit that divide between Satellite District and Neo-Domino City that I touched on earlier. When I mentioned that nobody cheers for Jack in Satellite, it's because Satellite's residents are regarded as scum and treated as second-class citizens by those in the city. But, of course, 5D's isn't content with such simple distinctions. Even within the city, there's a hierarchy with certain groups of people enduring worse treatment than others. Take Aki, for example. She's the daughter of a prominent politician, which should land her at the top of the social hierarchy. However, she has a unique power: the ability to materialize duel monsters and employ their effects beyond the confines of the game. After her powers manifest, she's packed off to a boarding school because she can't control them. Her situation swiftly worsens when she gets there, leading her to flee the school. Along the way, she encounters a man named Divine, who's the founder of Arcadia Movement, a secret organization that initially seems like a sanctuary for psychics. But, as it often goes, things aren't so simple. Arcadia Movement is, in reality, a military organization with the aim of creating an army of psychics to overthrow Neo-Domino City. The organization's leader intends to exact revenge on the rest of civilization for the mistreatment of his people. And just like that, a girl born into affluence who should have had every advantage finds herself ensnared by a terrorist organization. From being on top of the world with a loving family, to alone and afraid. Turned into a living tool for a homicidal maniac, simply because he offered her a semblance of love when no one else would. Fortunately for Aki, at some point Divine goes missing and Arcadia Movement crumbles practically overnight. Shortly after, Aki is informed of Arcadia's crimes and initially denies any involvement, but eventually she admits that she was aware of what was happening, yet chose to turn a blind eye because Divine made her feel loved when no one else did. To atone for her association with Arcadia Movement, Aki joins forces with Yusei and Jack to protect those who once repudiated her due to her psychic curse. And even though all of Satellite's residents are viewed equally as low-life scum by those in the city, there are various different factions within the district that are constantly at odds with each other. First, we need to understand how the divide occurred in the first place. About 17 years prior to the events of the first episode, an underground reactor called Moment, which provides power to the city, malfunctioned and exploded. This caused the ground beneath the city to rupture, dividing Neo-Domino City into two parts. One, which we still refer to as the city, and the other, a much smaller part, became known as Satellite District. Although they are technically still one city, the only remaining connection is a pipeline through which the city sends trash to the district to be compacted and processed by its residents. Sometime after the separation, the city began sending criminals to Satellite District as a new form of punishment, where they were forced to work in the factories. Along with the criminals came a new police force to keep them in check, and as the criminal population grew, the district gained a reputation as a prison camp of sorts. But given that the separation occurred only 17 years ago, there are still many decent people who live in the district, either by chance having been there when the malfunction occurred, or by birth in the time since. Unfortunately, this fact is lost on the police hailing from the city, which, as we are well aware, harbors a distorted perception of the district, resulting in the police treating everyone under their watch as criminal scum. The tyranny from the criminals and the city police, who initially were supposed to protect the civilians from the criminals, led to the formation of several gangs, most of which would simply fight over territory that ultimately did not belong to them, but some had more noble causes. Interestingly enough, Yusei and Jack were once part of one of these groups, but I'll talk more about that later in the video. When Yusei becomes king of games, the government assigns a police escort to watch over him when he travels, and the guy in charge of protecting him is Yugioh, the same officer who patrolled Yusei's part of the district. He's also the same guy from chapter 1 of the Yugioh manga, but that's a whole other thing. Much like all the other police officers from Neo Domino City, Yugioh harbors a deep disdain for the people of Satellite, seemingly deriving pleasure from acts of oppression. But when Yusei pays a visit to his old foster home, Yugioh is forced to tag along and he starts to open up. Despite initially wanting no part of it as he can't stand being around what he perceives as scum, things take a turn when Yugioh discovers that one of the foster children aspires to be a police officer. This revelation is mind-blowing for Yugioh, as even in the city, the police are often met with hatred and fear, yet this foster child in Satellite District views him as a real-life superhero. From this point onward, Yugioh starts to see Satellite's residents in a different light, to the extent that he even risks his own life to protect them, for the first time ever realizing his role as a purveyor of justice. Now, I know 5D's isn't the first anime to tackle heavy themes like vengeance, classism, and breaking the cycle of hatred, and I could certainly name some anime that do it even better. But it was quite the shock to see Yugioh, of all anime, and especially the one with motorcycles, tackle these weighty subjects and manage to earn my appreciation while doing so. Discussing topics like these in the context of a franchise primarily designed to sell trading cards is a challenging task and can easily devolve into pretentiousness. We cross. But 5D's pulled it off surprisingly well. Now let's shift our focus to one of the more underrated aspects of Yugioh 5D's: symbolism, particularly as it pertains to the monster cards. As I mentioned in the introduction of this video, I've always been a fan of the cards, long before I finally made the decision to watch the anime. But what truly stands out about the cards is how they are employed in the show, and I'm not talking about the battles. Yugioh 5D stands as the only anime where the cards themselves serve as a reflection of character development. There were hints of this in Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Monsters, particularly with Exodia, but the cards in the original series had fairly straightforward meanings. Pegasus, for example, used toon monsters because of his love for cartoons and his eccentric personality. Mako, a fisherman, utilized the legendary fisherman. Rex Raptor used dinosaur cards, and you get the idea. But 5D's took this concept to the next level with the Signer Dragons, which is basically just an umbrella term for the signature cards used by the main characters. Let's start with Black Rose Dragon. The design is based on roses, which are generally considered to be harmless, yet they also have thorns, making them prickly, capable of causing harm if approached carelessly. This symbolism, obviously, is intended to reflect Aki's personality, but the effect of the monster is also very telling. When this card is summoned, you can destroy all cards on the field, itself included. Black Rose's self-destructive effect mirrors Aki's own psychic powers, which can be equally as destructive to herself as they are to her surroundings. Yusei's monster, Stardust Dragon, doesn't tell us much about the user at a glance. If anything, it reminds me of Frieza's third form in Dragon Ball. But the effect of the card highlights a key trait of Yusei's character. You contribute this card to negate the activation of a card or effect that destroys a card or cards on the field. Simply put, Stardust Dragon can be sacrificed in order to protect other cards from being destroyed. Throughout the anime, Yusei consistently assumes the burdens of others, occasionally at the risk of his own life. In the first episode, a boy named Rowley presents Yusei with an upgrade for his D-Wheel motorcycle. When Yusei discovers that it was stolen, he willingly accepts the blame for the crime. In another instance, when Yusei's old friend Crow tries to join Yusei in his battle with the Dark Signers, Yusei instructs him to stay out of it. Later in the arc, during a life or death duel forced upon Yusei and Rowley, Yusei tries to lose intentionally. His readiness to extend himself for the sake of others is prevalent, and the effect of his signature card is emblematic of this trait. But everything changes when an old friend of Yusei's named Kiryu resurfaces. Remember when I mentioned that Yusei and Jack were a part of a gang in Satellite District? Kiryu served as the group's leader, and he and Yusei shared a close friendship. However, as the gang gained prominence, Kiryu's mental state deteriorated, leading to the group's dissolution. Things came to a head when Kiryu attempted to take out a police station in the district. Yusei, upon learning of Kiryu's plans, sought to aid Kiryu's escape and then turned himself in to assume responsibility for the attack, but the plan failed. And during Kiryu's arrest, he saw Yusei with the chief of police and assumed Yusei had been working with the authorities all along. Now released from incarceration, Kiryu harbors intentions of exacting revenge on Yusei. Upon their eventual reunion, Kiryu forces Yusei into a life-or-death duel. Although Yusei loses the duel, a malfunction in his own vehicle spares him from certain demise. As a result of this defeat, Yusei goes into a deep depression, having now failed twice to save Kiryu and apprehensive about dueling again due to the potential loss of his own life. After spending some time with the other signers, Jack in particular, Yusei comes to the realization that he's actually been a bad friend. The real reason he couldn't save Kiryu in the first place is he didn't believe in their bond. Yusei had denied Kiryu the opportunity to learn from his mistakes, opting instead to absolve Kiryu of all responsibility and shoulder the blame himself. When Yusei and Kiryu duel again, Yusei summons Stardust Dragon, and then it evolves into a new, more powerful monster called Majestic Star Dragon. This new card has two effects. The first mirrors Stardust Dragons, requiring self-destruction to protect another card, while the second does not necessitate self-sacrifice. Yusei wins the duel by employing the second effect, signifying a transformation in his character. Now, the act of summoning new ace monsters during battles for a last-minute victory is a common trope in Yu-Gi-Oh! Anime, but these moments are typically lacking in terms of impact, as they often symbolize nothing beyond the generic theme of the power of friendship. Even Exodia in Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Monsters, though it's a favorite example of mine, fails to match the depth conveyed by Stardust Dragon and Majestic Star Dragon. The former symbolizes Yusei's greatest strength, the willingness to shoulder others' burdens, and then as Yusei comes to realize that friendship's true power lies in the belief in one another, Majestic Star Dragon redefines this strength as a vulnerability. Yusei didn't defend his friends simply because that's what friends do, rather, he did so because he lacked faith in their bond. And just like the other Yu-Gi-Oh! Anime, there's a duel in almost every episode with new characters and a lot of new cards. So there are still a ton of monsters that have zero significance beyond their role in a duel, and those that do often exhibit surface level relevance. For example, Crow uses Crow-themed cards. But the character Crow is named after a famous Japanese general, so his cards have nothing to do with his personality or character arc. It's just a clever play on words. I know I tend to emphasize the importance of a strong supporting cast quite a lot in my Yu-Gi-Oh! Videos, and that's because Yu-Gi-Oh! Is about friendship, but a lot of the time, the friends, aka the supporting cast, they tend to fall to the wayside fairly early on with few exceptions. The original series was practically the Yugi and Joey show featuring Kaiba, and while Yu-Gi-Oh! GX was better at highlighting the supporting characters, a lot better in fact, most of them were phased out after a single arc, reduced to background characters. Manjome doesn't do much after he defeats his brothers, Sho is basically a cheerleader until one of the last arcs, and Hayato, who had one of the more interesting stories, was literally replaced at the end of Season 1 with a more annoying version of Sho. But to my surprise, this problem is almost non-existent in Yu-Gi-Oh! 5D's. A lot of that has to do with the way friendship is depicted in 5D's. It takes a lot more for Yusei to acquire his friends in the first place, and the one he started with doesn't really count as a friend. But more importantly, the show does a fantastic job of making each of Yusei's friends irreplaceable. With the exception of Jack, I feel that any one of the signers, and even some of the other side characters, could replace Yusei as the lead, and the show would be just as good. In fact, the story wouldn't be much different at all because so much of it hinges on the world building and the themes that we discussed earlier in this video. Of course, the power of friendship is still at the core of the series, but this time, the concept is more nuanced. It's not limited to the main character with a few exceptions here and there. It's a power that can be harnessed by any one of the signers. The reason some of the main characters are called signers to begin with is they all have a unique birthmark that is actually a piece of a legendary dragon called the Crimson Dragon. When Yusei and the other signers finally come to understand each other, each of the signer marks disappears and a new one is born. One that only appears during battles when a signer is in a desperate situation and needs the help of his comrades. Essentially, it's the same concept as Exodia, only executed a bit differently, and in my opinion, far better. In Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Monsters, Exodia is only used one time, and it's in the very beginning of the series. But the Crimson Dragon comes into play multiple times. And I love the fact that the signers are a bunch of misfits who were kind of forced to team up because of their marks, instead of the other way around, since the concept of found family is so important in Yu-Gi-Oh! 5Ds. Despite the show's success in intertwining profound subjects like breaking the cycle of hatred with trading card promotion, it faces a unique challenge. Yu-Gi-Oh! 5D's straddles the line between addressing serious themes and maintaining its identity as a children's show. As a result of this delicate balance, there were more than a few times where I found myself laughing out loud at things that were clearly not supposed to be funny. It's a bit like playing Shadow the Hedgehog. If you're unfamiliar with this game, it's a Sonic game where you play as Shadow instead of Sonic, allowing for morally ambiguous actions like aligning with villains and using weapons. And this isn't really an issue of morality, but Shadow even curses when he takes damage. Damn it. While Shadow embodies an edgier persona within the Sonic franchise, his character remains part of the Sonic universe. Similarly, Yu-Gi-Oh! 5D's introduces an edgy and cool vibe to the Yu-Gi-Oh! Franchise, yet, as with Shadow, there are limits to how far this dynamic can be pushed. A big reason for why it feels this way is something I like to call One Piece syndrome. Basically, there's this phenomenon in One Piece where one of the characters will appear to die, usually in the beginning of a story arc, and it's not just implied that they're dead. You'd be crazy to think they're still alive because of just how insane the circumstances are. But every time, without fail, the same character will appear at the end of the arc as if nothing even happened. In the beginning of the Skypiea arc, an old man is struck by God himself from the skies above. But that doesn't stop him from celebrating Luffy's victory at the end of the arc. Yu-Gi-Oh! 5D's does pretty much the same thing. Early in the show's story, Yusei meets a character named Saiga who has a tragic backstory. Saiga was a competitive D-wheeler, and one day while racing, he made a mistake that caused his teammate to crash straight into a wall, causing the vehicle to explode on impact. They literally show this while he's talking to Yusei about how his friend will never be able to duel again. Saiga also carries a burned up card that belonged to his ex-partner, but a few episodes later, Yusei meets Saiga again, and when he mentions the incident with his old friend, they show a different version of the same flashback. This time, his friend can be seen jumping out of the vehicle right before it crashes. This is next level deception, because it's not like Saiga didn't know the full story and now he's telling Yusei the new version of it. He's telling him the same thing, and they're showing us a different version of the flashback while he's telling us the same story. By the way, the English dub censored the first flashback by removing the explosion entirely, so this specific example doesn't exist in the English dub, but the fact that it was censored further demonstrates my point. Even the editors thought that the character was dying and they didn't want to show it. I'm about to spoil something major for this next example, so skip to the time on screen if you want to avoid that. Remember when I mentioned that the leader of Arcadia Movement went missing? That's technically true, but explaining it that way doesn't tell the whole story. The reason Divine was labeled as missing is he fell from the top of a skyscraper after losing a shadow game. And the reason Aki was willing to join Yusei and Jack right away is she witnessed his fall and naturally assumed that he was gonna die. But of course, that's not what happened, because at the end of the arc, Divine returns. Now, some might argue that Divine needed to return in order to bring Aki's character arc to its conclusion, and I kind of agree with that. But Aki doesn't even get to face him. The moment they're reunited, Divine uses psychic powers to control her mind. Then Yusei comes in and saves the day. So not only are they bringing a character back from the dead, they're using him to undercut Aki's story arc. Another issue, which is arguably even bigger than the first, is the motorcycles. It's hard to take the battle seriously when they look so ridiculous. I mean, it's bad enough that they're settling their problems with card games, but it's easy to let that slide because I know what I'm signing up for when I'm watching Yu-Gi-Oh! But adding this extra layer of motorcycles just takes things to a different level. First of all, they're not even racing. There are some exceptions to this, but nearly every riding duel is just a duel where both players are going in circles or a straight line until somebody runs out of life points. But that's not even the worst part. Again, there are some exceptions, but in almost every riding duel, the motorcycles are put into autopilot as soon as a duel begins. This is certainly more realistic than playing card games while driving at the same time, but I figured the purpose of the riding duels was to add a sense of danger. You can't always use magic to create tension in Yu-Gi-Oh! That'll get stale very quickly, so it makes sense that the duels get more creative with each Yu-Gi-Oh! Spin-off. But none of that matters if the vehicles are driving themselves. And it's so disappointing because the duels that don't use autopilot are incredible. Some of the enemies start manipulating the tracks during riding duels, causing autopilot to become a detriment. This forces the duelist to disable autopilot, and when this first happened, I was so excited. the motorcycles were finally coming into play, and since the characters were driving for real now, some of them were able to get more shine than others since driving was treated as a whole new skill. In a way, it felt like the show was just getting started. But they only do it a handful of times, and it doesn't start happening until the second half of the Dark Signers arc, so it ends up being far too little, far too late. Although I can't complain too much because a lot of the battles take place in the regular dueling style with no motorcycles involved, but I'd be lying if I said it didn't detract from the show at least a little bit. The final complaint I'll give concerns the second half of the show. It's terrible. The Dark Signers arc is fantastic, and while I don't hold it in quite the same regard as the Battle City arc, I can see why so many people consider it to be the best of all Yu-Gi-Oh anime. Suffice to say, this arc is a tough act to follow, but it ends in episode 65 out of 154, and after episode 65, the show takes a massive nosedive in terms of just about everything. Character relationships that were meticulously set up over the course of prior arcs and established by the end completely fall apart. In some instances, they're treated as if they never even happened, reverting back to square one. Even the monster designs fall off of a cliff. The show pivots away from the dragon theme and leans into the racing and technology side of things. At first, I thought this was going to be cool since the riding duels were only just starting to get interesting at the end of the Dark Signers arc. But the motorcycles stay in autopilot for nearly every duel, and the races are in circles. And the worst part is that the rest of the show is a gigantic tournament arc. We already had a tournament arc, and it was a good one. They did a fantastic job of building up the world that these characters operate in, only to spend more than half of the runtime driving in circles. It honestly feels like the writers were stuck with a bunch of time slots to fill, but had no idea what to do with the story. And I kinda get it, because the Dark Signers was so conclusive. Pretty much all of the goals that were set out by the heroes in the beginning of the series were accomplished. Yusei learned from the mistakes of his past, the Signers won the war, Yusei, Jack, and Crow have been reunited, and Neo Domino City has been made whole again. They should have ended the show there. I understand why they didn't, they needed to sell those Yu-Gi-Oh cards, but I can't recommend anyone continue watching after the Dark Signers arc. It's not completely unwatchable, but the enjoyable bits are few and far between. After episode 65, it feels like the studio is just dragging around the corpse of Yu-Gi-Oh 5D's to sell a product. But those are just my thoughts. Subscribe for more videos. Check out the Anime Authority podcast. There aren't any episodes out yet, but trust me, big things are on the way. Thanks for watching.